The current movement, which is typified by the bestsellers by Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, that calls itself anti-racism, is for all its proclaimed noble ends such a simplifying theory. It is neo-Marxist in replacing Marx's class binary with race. That it is also racist towards Blacks is perhaps less evident, though it has come through plainly to certain Black writers like John McWhorter, who, in describing Robin DiAngelo's best-selling White Fragility as a racist tract, objects to the infantilization of Blacks as pure victims, as people without agents.
So you made that argument in your talk through the Kenyan Alumni Association that the anti-racist movement of DiAngelo and Kendi are doing Marxism 2.0.
Well, I mean, it's not an argument. They're perfectly open about it. If you look at the book Colorblind Racism by Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and the first couple of pages, he's quoting the Communist Manifesto. The debt to Marx is very, very open. What they've taken from Marx is Marx's critique of liberalism. And that's on the Jewish question. You may have read it back when you were a freshman. And the argument goes like this. Liberalism gives everybody equal rights. That's nice. But in so doing, it abstracts from all kinds of social realities that really, really matter. In the case of Marx, wealth and power. And in doing that, in effect, it rationalizes, it lies, it masks fundamental inequalities that are a product of, in Marx's argument, class war. And so it is a rationalization, or as later Marxists would say, an ideology, a mask for actual power relations. And they've taken this argument whole and applied it to the subject of race, that colorblind racism, that equal rights without regard to what race you are, sounds very nice, but really it masks what is called systemic or structural racism, a deep-seated set of arrangements which always work in favor of whites and against people of color, or at least against Blacks. That they've taken over. Now, the problem is Marx understood that getting rid of the liberal guarantees and protections of individuals or groups against the state isn't enough. The problem immediately that will be raised is, then if you do that, you're simply going to install a new tyranny. You're going to install, Bakunin, the anarchist, said, look, you're just going to make the proletariat the new ruling class, and they're going to be more tyrannical than the bourgeoisie because there won't be any rights, or at least, I don't know that Bakunin didn't say that, but a liberal might say that last part. And Marx's answer was, but no, this is the proletariat. And what he meant was, if we get to communism, human nature will change. Or in early Marx, he calls it species being. We'll have human beings who are now no longer political. The state can wither away because we will all have the same interests. We'll be much more like ants and bees and not like the kind of selfish people we are now. Now, you can think that that's an unreasonable hope, or you can put your money on it. Either way, the anti-racists, as far as I can see, don't go there. And so they are left with a problem, which is, I guess they have to believe that once you get all the group numbers right and Blacks earn as much as whites and so forth, then everything will be okay. But without a predicted change in human nature, a la Marx, it's very hard to see how you will not need eternally a ruling group that gives everyone what that ruling group thinks everyone deserves, and do it not as individuals, but by groups. So that's, I think, an important difference between the anti-racists and the Marxists they borrow from.
So DiAngelo quotes that famous Lee Atwater quote.
In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. All right, I won't hear it. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
She uses this to say that white supremacy conceals itself. And, you know, when you're talking about doing away with the graduate income tax, what you're really talking about is making things better for white people. Do you buy that?
I'd like to ask you a question.
Yeah.
In this discussion, words are very important. Certain things are used to characterize phenomena, and they're often very loaded. And white supremacy, what do you think she means by white supremacy?
I think she's taking the term white supremacy, which has become a term that only represents, you know, those with KKK masks.
Right.
And then complicating it to represent general society and say, well, if whites are in power, then there must be this idea of white supremacy where whites want to protect their own.
What she means is that there is an objective situation, which you can call structural racism or systemic racism, which invariably brings whites to the top and puts blacks down. And that what white supremacy now is, and what white racism now is not a subjective belief in inferiority of blacks, but a passive acceptance of an objective situation which is unfair to minorities and especially to blacks. Would you accept that as the right characterization?
I think there are two strains that she criticizes, and one of them is the passive acceptance, which she terms white solidarity. There's another thing that's slightly more nefarious, which is actively participating, which is white fragility, where whenever you're challenged, you react defensively.
Well, what she calls acting defensively is the person who thinks he's not a racist or she's not a racist saying, I'm not a racist. In some way, her approach reminds me of that old joke about the Orthodox Freudian who says to you, Matt, you have an Oedipus complex. And then you say in return, no, I don't. And the Orthodox Freudian says, there, that proves it. Yeah? What you have, that second strand, is based on the first. There's an assertion that we know what the objective situation is, and we know how to fix it. And from that, anyone who varies from that is de facto like a racist, and therefore we call them racists and we call this white supremacy. The reason I'm being pedantic about this is that this is a huge point. When you move from calling racism what racists believe, a subjective point of view, to taking the objective point of view and saying you might as well be a conscious racist, that's a move that is very, very fateful. The second thing is, are they right? And then that's a huge question, but right about what? White supremacy, whiteness. Who's white?
Well, in her book, DiAngelo makes the argument that whiteness has changed over time. She talks about actual court cases where, you know, Armenians were decided to be white in a court case. So she acknowledges that whiteness has not always included all the people it includes now.
Are East Asians white?
I'm obviously not going to say, okay, here's who's white and here's who's not.
But I raised the question about East Asians for a reason.
Okay.
I just read that in the state of Washington, RANTZ, R-A-N-T-Z school board was doing a study of the grades, the relative grades of people of color, POC, as opposed to whites. And they found, I think, to their distress, that the people of color were doing awfully well. So what they did is they factored out the East Asians, or the Asians in general, and added them to the whites, and then they could show what they wanted to show, which is, boy, people of color are doing badly. But to do that, they had to move the East Asians into the white category. That's one example. Another example is after the January 6th riots, it turned out that everybody said that the racism was deeply involved in it. And I think, well, clearly a lot of the people who were there were white racists, pure and simple, in the simple old-fashioned version of the word. But they were also, one of the leaders of QAnon turned out to be Black. And that posed a problem. Professor Christina Beltran explained that there is a thing called multiracial whiteness, where there are people of color who support Trump because they want to benefit from white privilege. Yeah? So at this point, whiteness no longer means white people. It is, according to Beltran, a political project that has developed historically. What whiteness comes to mean then, and white supremacy comes to mean then, ultimately, is no longer connected to race. Oddly enough, it becomes a word like bourgeois for the communists, which simply means evil. And anybody, no matter what their group is, who can be labeled as white is evil. So the question of whiteness, I think, ought to be usefully reframed. What you describe absolutely happened, yes. One group after another that didn't really belong began to belong. It's called assimilation, and it's not into whiteness. Whiteness is only the term for it if you're looking at it on the racial axis because you have Blacks in mind. What you're really talking about, I think, is assimilation into normal America. And the problem we're facing is about not Blacks as such, but a certain group of Blacks. And of that group, only a certain group of them. I'll give you an example, what I'm talking about. At Cornell University, my alma mater, there was a demonstration, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, by American Black students. And they were angry that the admissions office at Cornell was filling the Black quota with West Indians and Africans. We demand that Cornell admissions come up with a plan to actively increase the presence of underrepresented Black students on this campus. We define underrepresented Black students as Black Americans who have several generations, more than 2 in this country. So if West Indian Blacks and African Blacks are doing well, and of course it's relative, but as I understand it, Nigerian Americans are the best educated ethnic group in this country. We're really talking not even about race simply, but about a particular group, the so-called ADOS, American descendants of slavery. And we're talking about a group of them, the ones who have not entered the middle class as so many have. And one can argue in favor of affirmative action, as I think McWhorter does, that it succeeded in increasing the Black middle class pretty rapidly. We're talking about a particular group of people who haven't gotten over the hump with the rest of us. And the reasons for that are laden and complicated, and yes, racial prejudice is certainly a part of it and a big part of it, but it's not the whole story.
Let's boil down to what it is that DiAngelo and Kendi are getting at when they say that if you disagree with us, you're wrong. They're saying, if you disagree with us, that systemic racism exists and is the cause of these issues, then you're wrong. Say,
Right.
so they're not in their minds arguing something that's that controversial. They just want everyone to acknowledge that systemic racism exists and it can account for lots of things. And if you're going to talk about culture as the more important factor, then yes, you are being racist in their minds.
What, again, okay, let's talk about systemic racism. Again, let me ask you, what do you mean by that? What's systemic about it?
It's systemic in the sense that, statistically speaking, in multiple areas, whether it's housing or voting or policing, what have you, Blacks are receiving the short end of the stick, or
Good.
people of color are receiving the short end of the stick, and especially Blacks.
Good. That is not, that's circular. Yeah. You say, I have a phenomenon and therefore the cause is X. That's not an argument for the cause. That's the phenomenon. I agree. That's the phenomenon we have to look at. But to leap from that to, well, it's got to be the fault of racism in some sense, I would say, and here I rely on Thomas Sowell, and he spent his life demonstrating that you would never expect different ethnic groups, different social groups to do as well as each other. I mean, they vary. The rate of assimilation, of increase, of moving out of poverty of Blacks in the period up to the 1960s was enormous, before the Civil Rights Act. 30%, additional 18% after that. It slowed in the 60s, after the Civil Rights Movement. Why? Now, Sowell argues it was very much had to do with the welfare policy, that you created a culture of dependency. Is he right? Is he wrong? I don't know. But the figures seem to show that this isn't an inheritance from slavery. And it happened largely, I think, because of white social policies. Another example would be the projects. You had people coming up to the north, from the south, the rural south, looking for jobs, and they were put into Corbusier ideal worker housing. And everybody knows now that was a disaster for the people in them. And it was a progressive movement. Then there was drugs. And then paradoxically, or contradictorily, there's the war on drugs. And John McWhorter argues that, I think it makes a lot of sense, the war on drugs actually increases criminality among young Black males, because their lives are so miserable. They'd see falsely, but they see a quick way to make a buck and to be somebody by selling drugs, by becoming a runner for some dealer. There are so many things that have been done largely by whites, and very often by white progressives who were trying to help, that actually hurt. And in some way, it seems to me that the appeal of the anti-racism, it's all structural racism argument, is that it allows white liberals not to take responsibility for their own failures, not to go back and look and say, what the heck did we do? And why doesn't helping people in some direct way work?
What is the solution of then to deal with, for instance, these hiring practices that we talked about? How can those issues be solved or addressed?
Sure. I mean, you're talking about something extraordinarily, it's like a wound that has scar tissue in it and is also infected. I mean, the obvious things that are important are education, and education is inseparable from family life, from home life. A kid who hasn't been able to sleep all night won't be attentive in school. That's, I think, where it's very easy to throw up your hands and say, well, let's go to systemic racism, because the actual problem has so many different sides to it. So there are thousands of possible policy arguments, and everything I say can be confuted. Maybe charter schools are no good, but there are thousands of small things that if we had a mind to it, I think we could have those policy arguments and try different things, experiment. We have a federal system still. Different states can try different things, which would actually help, rather than turn it into a general theological debate.
So we went from talking about the problem being, in this case, the study shows that if you take resumes of people with a Black sounding name, something like Tyrone, versus a maybe a more Anglican name like John Smith, that you send out the resume with the Anglican white sounding name 10 times, you get one call back. You only change the name.
Yeah.
You get a call back after you send out it 15 times, right? So that's obviously not as good.
Yeah.
So why would the solution then be, oh, we need to improve education?
At some point, you have to deal with that gut level response. This person is not one of us. This person will probably not be very good. You have to change the perception based on reality. And that takes a long time. You can say you must hire, that's affirmative action, X people, yeah, of this race. That's the shortcut. But you will have done nothing to the perception.
But won't you? Because then you're putting these people in a position of power, and then they can, bring that economic security to the next generation.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say, and that I'd concede to you and McWhorter, that affirmative action to some degree did that. And that helped to some degree. But the problem is, the idea was that it was going to do a lot more than that. It was going to change perceptions, because it was going to help not just the elite, but it was going to help the whole Black population. 1964, the Civil Rights Act. 1965, the Voting Rights Act. That was the end of a long, long, long journey. And finally, the country grudgingly admitted, and finally, not even so grudgingly, admitted that, yeah, the principles of the Declaration really are true. They really are valid. We're not going to discriminate on grounds of race anymore. The progressives, folks in charge, decided to help a little bit extra. That we would have what's called affirmative action, which is a term from labor law, meaning to take, you probably know this, to take affirmative action to make up for a harm you've done, and apply it to hiring. First, it was only applied to recruitment. That was Johnson. And then, crucially, it was the Nixon administration, George Shultz, Secretary of Labor, who turned it into goals and timetables for hiring. And in doing that, you reintroduced race discrimination. You violated the basic principles of the Declaration. Again, if you remember Frederick Douglass's great speech, he says to his audience, the Declaration is the ring bolt of your liberties. Hold on to it. And they let go of it. And the reasoning was, and I remember the arguments because I participated in them, oh, well, this is just for a short time. Oh, no, we're not really violating any of our principles. We're just sort of helping a little. In the Bakke case, Justice Blackmun said, I hope it'll be over in 10 years. It's just a little help. But what they did was they created the principle that race discrimination is okay if it's corrective. And that little loophole, which in the Bakke decision was called diversity, now it's Kendi. It's Kendi saying that we're going to define people by race, we're going to define them by group, we're going to be racialist, we're going to take from the ones who have and give to the ones who haven't. That's what happens when you violate that principle. And affirmative action did that. And those of us who were working on the question and opposing it back in the early 70s, we said sooner or later, this is just going to justify white racism. And again, I was wrong. For a long, long time, I was wrong. I kept expecting that backlash. But in 2016, I think we got it. So affirmative action has a huge burden to bear, not so much in terms of what it did, but in terms of its principle and its justifications. If we could have just done it and shut up about it, I think it would have been better. But no, we had to justify it. And the only way really to justify it is ultimately to throw out liberalism. Another thing to be said about it, though, and this is the mismatch problem. In education, when you have MIT and Harvard really want to get a lot of black students, they're going to take students who could probably do very well in an engineering program at Syracuse, but they're going to be in the bottom 10th at MIT. And they may end up dropping out altogether, or they may move into easier majors. But you then end up with people who are in a terrible, terrible bind. And I think, again, it's very tough to be black in the affirmative action system. Because on the one hand, you have to say, the preference I'm getting to be advanced over people maybe with better grades is legitimate and justified. But you also have to say it's totally, there's nothing really there. I'm as able as anybody else. And while it's, I think, often the case that, yeah, the grades aren't that important and you really, these people are very often as good and better. Just the bind that it puts you in. Yeah. People will look at you and say, oh, affirmative action higher. And you will resent that. And you will be right to resent that, except that it's kind of built in. So there's that problem. And then the mismatch problem, which means loss of human potential. And then there is the encouragement to white racism that comes with it. So I think it has an awful lot of downsides. And the plus, I don't think, comes near to outweighing the downsides. Now, I've been arguing this since 1974, and I'm obviously biased on the subject. But again, I think affirmative action was a progressive shortcut, and there's nothing in those shortcuts that works as well over time as you got the job because you deserved it because you're the best candidate. Yeah. The example of successes by blacks that are not tainted by, oh, well, it was affirmative action, are enormously powerful. And if whites hadn't come in and said, look, we're helping, and made it all about them again, I think it would have been better.
Subscribe to Coburn Classroom and be on the lookout for new videos.